Good everyone, in this video today we have a Should You Talisman episode on the P-47 D-28. This will also apply to the D-30 since they're pretty much the exact same plane. So that's why the title looks a bit unusual. It's because they're practically the same plane, it's just the D-30 has air brakes and that's literally it. So before I begin, for those that are familiar with the channel, you'll obviously notice that this aircraft does not have a talisman, but that is because this is going to be explained in just a moment. For those that are new to the channel, this isn't normal for this series. This series revolves around me talking about vehicles that I have a talisman on that have already been featured in my talisman series. Now, of course, this is something that would be normal for people on my channel, but I'm going to obviously be explaining it for everyone to understand. So every 2 weeks, we will be taking a vehicle that either you guys suggest or I pick myself. Obviously, I'm picking this plane because I've always wanted to talk about it. And we will be looking at them in a traditional format of the Should You Talisman series. But of course, I don't have a talisman on this vehicle. But if I'm picking it, it's something that I would choose if I was to choose a talisman for a vehicle in that specific tree. In the description below, as per usual with this series, there's going to be a few timestamps. There's obviously going to be the weaponry, armor, flight performance, and of course the competition conclusion. So if you want to skip ahead to that, please do feel free to do so. With that all out of the way, and hopefully some confusion cleared up, we can now get into the weaponry, armor, and the engine of this aircraft. So the weaponry, of course, with it being a P-47, is probably the most recognisable part of this aircraft, bar the massive four-bladed prop. And it's the guns themselves, because, well, I would have thrown in the bombs, but we'll talk about those shortly. So the P-47 D-28 and all the other P-47s in the game have 850 caliber 12.7 mil, if you don't know what 50 cal is, M2 Browning machine guns with 425 rounds in each gun. You get 4 in each wing, and it is insane firepower. Now, of course, it doesn't have the cannon level of damage, like where you're snapping wings off and things like that immediately. These guns tend to rely more on fires and pilot snipes. As a result, against certain German bombers at 6.0, which will not be named, and I don't mean the 177, this can be tricky to deal with, but once you get your aim down and you know what to target, you generally can kill them quite comfortably. But of course, that is down to you learning that. These machine guns are highly effective against ground targets as well, with them being able to take out light targets such as light tanks, artillery, AAA pieces, and even light pillboxes with little issue, and anything that can't be done by these machine guns will be taken out by the CAS ability of this aircraft. And to put it simply, the CAS ability of this aircraft is insane. The engine is the next part we're going to talk about. We have the Pratt & Whitney R2863 engine with nearly 2400 horsepower off-wep and just a bit over 2700 horsepower on-wep. This is a large amount of power, but obviously with this being quite a large fighter, it is necessary. But the simple fact of the matter is, this aircraft more than makes use of this engine, especially given that the supercharger is directly underneath it, which that thing is a beast the moment you get this thing to altitude. Let's put it that way. In terms of other weaponry for the aircraft, we obviously do have access to secondary weapons. We have a wide selection here. We have 500-pound bombs, 1,000-pound bombs, M8 bazooka rockets, and of course HVAR rockets. The two that I would personally recommend using is the 1,000-pound bomb and the 500-pound bomb, with the 10 HVAR rockets, and if you can't afford the extra HVAR rockets, just take the bombs and you'll be fine. These bombs are devastating to nearly every tank that's going to come across, and let's put it this way, if these bombs don't kill the target, you either suck with your aiming or you are trying to bomb a mouse. That's probably the only thing I can think of that would maybe survive a miss from this bomb. The 500-pound bomb got a buff about a year ago, so this bomb is a little bit more effective than it used to be, and it's actually much better now. And obviously with it being a different 500-pounder to what it used to be, this gives the P-47 even more CAS ability. And of course this thing can do base bombing, but I would not advise it, because, well, you're in a P-47 and I would just not recommend it anyway. So, overall, its weaponry and flight performance, well, the engine at least, seems quite good. But then we come to the armor, which is the letdown. For something that is well known for taking a beating in real life, this plane really does lack. So if we take a look at the armor plate, it's 9.5mm of steel, with a little bit underneath the windscreen itself, and of course the bulletproof glass protecting the pilot. This isn't great, and the wings are quite vulnerable to damage from cannon fire and will easily snap off, yet in real life this thing could take an absolute beating. The fuselage can be pretty tanky against most machine guns, but of course against cannons it will tear this thing apart. So do not rely upon the old history documentaries. This plane isn't as durable in the game as you think. So just bear that in mind. But overall, this thing has a lot going for it. It's got a big, powerful engine which propels this thing to high altitude, a decent propeller to help with that, 850 caliber machine guns which will rip anything to pieces, and anything that doesn't, the bombs will, as well as the rockets. This thing is a menace in ground RB. It's a menace in air RB if it's flown well. But of course, there are some drawbacks, and that is what we're going to cover in the flight performance part of the aircraft, of course, with it being in a test flight and everything. So speaking of that, I'm going to jump us into a test flight, and I will see you all very shortly. And welcome to the test flight. If you've just skipped here, you've pretty much just missed the sheer, shall we say, benefits of this aircraft. But obviously we are going to talk about a couple of flaws with this aircraft. One of which being the climb rate. Now, it is good, but obviously you're not going to be beating stuff like the German stuff. So make sure to consider that if you are going to talisman this plane. Its climb rate is very good once you get it up to higher altitudes due to the supercharger. But you've got to bear in mind, this thing is not a 1 in 9. It's not a G6. It's not going to be climbing like it has just been stabbed in the back and is running for its life. It's not going to be like that. This plane will absolutely do very well at higher altitudes, but it is not a climbing aircraft like the BF-109 and the other respective aircraft like the A6M0 and the A7M Repu. This is just something to consider. But considering how good this plane is for its weight and everything, you really can just do anything in this plane, for the most part. Now, I'm sure some of you are actually wondering, because there might be a couple of you wondering, why there's a Thunderbolt on the tail? Well, this plane and me, we have a bit of history. So a few years ago, this is obviously relevant to the plane itself, but there was an event that I did with some people where pretty much everyone took Mustangs, bar me. I took this, because I trusted this plane more than the Mustang. This was before the P-51C came into the game, which I'll likely be featuring in this sort of every couple of weeks series sort of thing. But I dominated the entire German team in just this plane alone because my teammates were all Muppets and turned fighted in Mustangs all day long. So if I can do that in this, it's got to be good. It's as simple as that. The German players for the most part knew what they were doing. But the simple fact of the matter is, I used this plane's advantages, tried to avoid its disadvantages, such as its heavy weight and its low altitude performance is fine. What I meant is low speed handling. With it being so big and heavy, this plane does lack in quite a few areas. But what it makes up for in its overall performance with top speed, its roll rate being pretty good, the rudder being quite acceptable, and the overall handling using the rudder and elevators, this thing is an absolute menace. And if you set your gun conversions high up, you can definitely, well, I say high up, you want to set it for about 500 to 400 meters if you really want the most amount of damage on vehicles. But obviously I'm running 600 at the minute on this. But the simple fact of the matter is, this plane's overall performance at high altitude, at medium altitude, and at low altitudes are more than enough. And when it comes to strafing ground targets, this thing is no exception. You can even use the rudder to help out and everything, just strafe up targets, and anything light that is unfortunate to meet these 850 cals, Let's just say they're going to have more holes in them than cheddar cheese, because 850 cals are just that devastating. Single pass on a crude truck. That truck's dead. That truck's also dead. Those trucks are now on fire and are out of control. And that was a short burst from these 850 cals. Now you can imagine what something like a plane would have to experience. And as I said about the bombs, this thing's handling is exceptional to the point where you can pinpoint drop these bombs. Obviously I don't have bombs on now, but any poor tank like that Chi-He down there would be very unfortunate to meet this plane. What more can I really say? So let's head back to the hangar and let's discuss this vehicle's competition. See you shortly. And welcome back to the hangar. So before I continue, I'm just going to state something that might not be obvious. Depending on when this video releases, it is likely that the patch has possibly released by then. As a result, the tech tree that you see before you will be very different, such as the Helldivers going down to rank 2, still sad about that. The F4U1D also going down to rank 2, and there's going to be a load of other changes around the respective battle ratings and ranks and everything. So just bear that in mind if you see this tree right now, it is obviously before the patch. But anyway, so when it comes to competition, the P-47 D-28 doesn't really have a huge amount in the rank 3 regard. Now obviously I am considering the fact that the changes are happening, so just bear that in mind. But for a more... Well, the problem is with the P-47 D-28, it's a very, very good plane. Same with the D-30, because obviously it's the same plane but with air brakes. This is just something that it's more of an experience, like semi-experienced / experienced player sort of plane. That's its main problem, because you have to know what to do with it. I see a lot of D-28's turn fighting, and it really makes me sad, because I know how good this thing is. I used to take it to 6.3 back when it was 4.7. And I would pretty much just clean up German teams with it on my own. And there would be even cases where my squad mates in better planes, like P-51Hs, they were struggling to deal with some of the competition. But obviously because of this thing having the raw performance and the firepower to back it up, and of course the CAS ability, this thing was actually having more consistent games at around 6.063 than the P-51Hs on my team were. Now, of course, the H is a better plane, there's no questioning that. But for something to match this competition, it's going to need to be good. Now, for a more less experienced player, one of my go-tos would be the P-63C5. This is a rather slept-on plane, because obviously you have to go through 3 or 2 other P-63s to get it. But this is more of a jack-of-all-trades, master of none. I've always liked the King Cobras. Back in the olden days, I didn't, but I've always liked the King Cobras because of their versatility and the fact that they're just good at everything. They don't excel at anything. Like the C5 is a bit more horsepower, but trades a bit of turn rate for that. And whilst it is a good plane, it's not the best. It's just average. But of course, having a 37mm M10 cannon always helps out. And of course, it does carry some bombs, 3 500-pounders. And with good performance to boot, especially at higher altitudes because of the supercharger in this engine, it is still pretty solid. But of course, it isn't what I would say is P-47 worthy. Same with something like the P-61C1. I absolutely adore this aircraft. But there's a good reason why I'm not going to suggest it for someone who's more experienced like myself. Because the P-61 is a glass cannon. And it's also not very forgiving for newer players. It's more of a, you play it because you know that you're not going to be running into too much danger. With 420mm cannons, it will butcher any bomber you come across, and it will butcher any fighter you come across. But the problem is, you need the EFS unlocked on it, there's no questioning with that. And it's got glass tail syndrome. Its performance is very good, but I just don't think it's worthy of a talisman. It is something to consider, though, if you do want something that's a bit more twin engine, a bit more heavy, something a bit more versatile, because obviously this can kill an entire base on its own, and of course the guns are a bit more consistent, but it is obviously down to you. And going into the rank 4s, which I wouldn't really go up a rank when it comes to this sort of series, but given how much the change is going to be happening, it's really my only option. My only other suggestion would probably be the F4U4B, but obviously this plane, it is tricky to learn. I will say that, like, for newer players, this is a tricky aircraft, and obviously you have to grind all this way to the tech tree just to slap a talisman on. So that is a consideration. But if you do have the choice, it's either the F4U4B or the H. It's as simple as that. Of course, coming over to bombers and ground attackers, there isn't really anything. The only thing that is worthwhile is the B-25, and that's at a push. Because the B-25 is a solid bomber, but yeah, it's definitely past its sell-by date, and I definitely think the Mitchells could do with going down in BR, same with the Marauder, because they've still not fixed the Marauder's issues. The B-17s could definitely go down in BR, in my personal opinion, because these things are just... they're flying tinderboxes at this point. And other than that, there's the PBJ, but I wouldn't recommend this for a new, like, anyone. Yes, it's a B-25, but the B-25 has... well, it's close to a B-25, but the B-25 has the bomber spawn, which it can dive quite fast as well, get in and out relatively consistently, and can kill a base. The PBJ can't do that because it gets a strike aircraft spawn. So as you can see, it's not very easy to find a potential, shall we say, competitive aircraft that matches the P-47's metrics, because there isn't many. And the only real ones I'd suggest are the 63C5, the 61 at a push, the F4U4B, and the P51H, but you've got to grind to get there first. It's just one of those things, really. But now we come to the conclusion. If the amount of positivity didn't come across enough already, if you are looking for something to talisman, and you're a decent enough player, and you understand how boom and zoom sort of things work, this plane is an absolute menace. There's a reason why I used to club in it back when I could take it to 6-3 and just have fun. Nowadays I don't need to do that because this thing gets 6-0 matches quite consistently. And yeah, I absolutely love this thing. I did obviously start flying this thing when I was a noob and I had no idea how to fly it. And obviously it may take you practice, but once you do, you've got yourself a cracker. But anyway, I'm going to leave all to it for today. I hope you enjoyed seeing the P-47 D-28/30 as part of the Should You Talisman series. If you have any suggestions as to what you want to see, let me know in the comments below. And of course, if no one picks anything, I'll pick myself. It will probably be the P-51C in that case. But anyway, I'll leave all to it for today, and I'll see you all on the next one.